Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Drug Diaries. I'm your host, Kaushik Trivedi, and today we are embarking on an extraordinary journey into the realm of aging and longevity research. Imagine a world where the ravages of time could be slowed or even reversed. A world where your 80th birthday doesn't mean slowing down, but thriving with the vitality of your 40s. This isn't science fiction, my friends. This is the cutting edge of longevity research. For centuries, humans have dreamt of extending our health span, of pushing back against the inevitable march of time. From the mythical fountain of youth to modern day biohacking, we've been captivated by the possibility of living longer, healthier lives. But now, for the first time in human history, we are not just dreaming, we are doing this. In the labs across the globe, scientists are unraveling the mysteries of aging at the cellular level. They are identifying genes that contribute to longevity, developing drugs that could slow the aging process, and even exploring ways to reprogram our cells to a more youthful state. This isn't just about adding years to life, but life to years. It's about redefining what it means to grow old, about maintaining our health and vitality well into our later decades. The implications are staggering. From reducing the burden of age-related diseases to reshaping our societal structures and economies. And today, we have the perfect guide to lead us through this fascinating landscape. I'm thrilled to welcome Karl Pfleger, founder of AgingBioTech.info and a prominent investor and advisor in the longevity biotech space. Karl's journey is as fascinating as the field he works in. From a PhD in computer science at Stanford to a career in AI and tech, Karl's path took an unexpected turn when he became captivated by the potential of longevity research. Now he's at the forefront of biotech revolution, tracking the latest developments and investing in the most promising technologies. In today's episode, we'll be exploring the current state of longevity biotech. We'll discuss the most exciting areas of research, the challenges facing the field, and the incredible potential these technologies hold. Karl will give us insights into the investment landscape, helping us understand where the smart money is betting on our longer, healthy futures. We'll also delve into some of the ethical considerations surrounding life extension and ponder what a world with significantly extended lifespan might look like. So whether you are a science enthusiast, a health conscious individual, or simply curious about what the future might hold, this episode promises to be an eye-opening exploration of one of the most exciting frontiers in modern science. So buckle up, listeners. We are about to take a journey into the future of where age truly might just be a number. Welcome to Longevity Revolution. And now, let's welcome our guest, Karl Pfleger. Karl, welcome to Drug Diaries.
Thanks. It's great to be here. Great and a good intro.
Likewise, it's
You captured the excitement of this moment in history reasonably well.
Karl, what inspired you to start AgingBioTech.info, and what sparked your interest in the intersection of aging and biotechnology?
Well, I worked at Google and we made some good money, and the philosophy there in the 2000s was to change the world and to change it for the better. And many, when we had some decent success with that, many people there who really just had it in their blood try to change the world for the better and try to find the biggest impact things, started looking around for how they could make other impacts besides what Google was doing, how they could help the global poor or do something else with big impact. It was the beginning of the effective altruism, the seeds of things like effective altruism at the time. There was something called the Copenhagen Consensus, where some really smart people tried to get together and said, if you had $1 billion extra, how could you help the most people? And there was a lot of sort of analytical thought around what is the best way to help the largest number of people with the highest leverage. And so me and some others were working on global poverty reduction and helping the people who live on less than $1 or less than $2 a day. I started learning about the science of aging and how the biology, the molecular pathologies that underlie aging really are the main risk factors for all chronic diseases that are all the top killer diseases of humans. And that basically 70% of all humans that ever die directly as a result of aging. And it's 92+% in developed countries, including the US. And from a change the world for the better, save the most lives, or increase the most healthy years, with whether in development economics they use dailies or quality adjusted life years or disability adjusted life years. And by any of these sort of analytic techniques, fixing aging was comparable to the best other things were better. And it was a scientific problem with an engineering component right up my alley. And so I decided that was going to be, my previous mission in life had been human level artificial intelligence. And, that was sort of on the way, but I'd been working on that. I switched whole hog.
Wow, that's a fascinating transition from technology to life sciences and healthcare. And did you have any background in healthcare and life sciences before Google?
I did not have any direct educational background. I did have a lifelong, multi-decade long personal interest in how to live a healthy lifestyle and how that affects long-term health. And so personal longevity, personal health optimization kind of interest. And so, of course, that's related, and that was beneficial. But it was a lot of learning of biology that I didn't know, and that continues today because nobody can know it all. So I definitely have holes in my knowledge base relative to people who went through undergrad and grad and got PhDs. But on the other hand, I've deep dived onto a lot of things, and I know a large breadth of stuff. And in fact, that's what I'm sure we're going to get to talking about my website, and that's one of the reasons I started it. Because it's clear that even the top professors in the field were having trouble keeping up with how fast things were moving and how much was.
Right. And what was your biggest challenge in creating the platform and curating the latest developments in this space? Since we're talking about the website, I had a chance to go through it, and as you say, it's very simplistic, and that's what makes it unique. There are no distractions. It's simple. You get the information what you're looking for, and it just comes straight to the point. And that's what I admire about your website the most.
I worked at Google for a long time, and that's the sort of same philosophy, right? A blank page with just the information on it.
Exactly.
So let's take a step back, and we'll give the mini history, right? So I got into the field when I didn't know anything. What I first started doing was just philanthropy. So I've been, sending charitable money to research organizations that do good research in the field, like the Buck Institute, which is up north of San Francisco. And after a few years of that, I decided to start doing investing because NIH budgets were dwindling, and it was becoming clear that the way to get more experiments done and therefore have the field continue to move more quickly was to start funding experiments, not just with grant money from big scientific government funders, but to tap into some portion of the venture capital money in the world. So that was just about starting to happen around mid 2010s. And so I started doing that in 2017. And after a year of that and noting all the different companies that I ever heard about at any event that I went to, I realized that the number of companies that existed and that were trying to do some useful things and useful science and then develop it to get it into millions of people was actually 3 or 4 or maybe 5 times larger than most of even the insiders in the field realized that it was. And there were a couple really smart investors who were focused on the field, not many at the time who had a sense of the breadth, but they kept their lists private. And I got into the investing more to make the field go faster than to make my own money grow. It wasn't about the money. So I decided the best thing I could do for the field would be to sort of create a big list and open source it. And so I made a list of the 120 companies circa 2018 to 2019, launched it in 2019. And at the time, it got really great reception because a lot of people didn't realize. Now, there were some interesting, the question you asked was, what were the difficulties, right? So there were some interesting difficulties along the way. A couple of the interesting hiccups I'll just mention here. The first was what even before the website was the investing part. When I started the investing, I wanted to initially do it by creating a foundation and invest from the foundation, and then have the foundation's returns when it invested in good companies and made a good pot, just go right back into, because the foundation would only get taxed at 1 or 2%. But it turns out that's really hard to do. And, some other conversation, we can go into why it's hard to do most of the startup investing from a foundation. But so then onto the website. So the first difficulty I had with the website was I really wanted, at the time in the late 2010s, there was a lot of discussion and a lot of written words about aging and longevity. There were a growing number of books. There were several, not many, but a few blogs, a few long-standing blogs like Fight Aging. Lifespan.io existed, and they wrote news articles. And there were some podcasts. So there was a lot of prose. There was a lot of paragraphs of text. What there wasn't was a lot of structured information, a lot of databases or tables, things that you could, add numbers together, sort, restrict, give me all the things that are just this subset of the data. So I really wanted to create a resource that was structured and you could play with. And so I decided to make a table in just a spreadsheet, but essentially a flat file database. And it turns out that the web had really been around for almost 25 or 30 years, and Google had been around organizing it for almost 20 years. And Google was really good at surfacing the best pages. And we also had even moved from, spreadsheets have been around for decades. And we had, Google had even 10 years ago made spreadsheets work on the internet. But it turned out that, and Wiki software and Wikipedia had a clunky tables mechanism, but it turned out there wasn't actually a really good way to make tables on the internet and just make them pages that Google would index and give page rank to. If you made a Google Doc, Google Sheets thing, it got this crazy URL. And so, figuring out how to just make something where like it could have its own page rank and blah. And it, this was pre-Airtable being big and Notion. And I did look at those, and they were clunky and they had problems, and their business models weren't tuned to this. Anyway, so the Google Sheets is what underlies the site, and that's not perfect and has many negatives, but it does work, and it allows all the tables on the site to be sortable, restrictable. You can say, give me only the therapeutic companies. You can say, give me only the companies with more than 10 employees. You can combine all these, much like a normal SQL database query, but in a more easy UI way. And so it works, and it's very, very easy to edit and modify and collaborate with, which is great. And it has some advantages over Airtable Notion for this open source wiki-like one-to-many kind of environment, rather than being tuned for an enterprise business that uses it as an internal tool. But so that took, so that was one thing that just took a couple months of research and frustration. And then, the big work was just actually getting all the information, right? So, there's a lot, it's all out there, it's all on the web, but organizing it, synthesizing it, and bringing it together and making it useful and organized was a lot of work. But it was very useful and interesting work. And I was really glad to have had all that info go in front of my eyeballs, because it helped me learn about the field, which was great. And that's, and that's the first step in then other people using the tool to themselves learn about the field.
Right. And if I understand it correctly, I think this is still a philanthropic pursuit. You don't monetize your website at all.
That's right. This is basically a nonprofit, non-commercial, purely pro bono, Wikipedia-esque, like in nature, trying to basically make the field go faster by making all this information available to everyone in the world who wants it. And and that's a whole bunch of different intended use case audiences, right? So I wanted all the people who thought about, say, when I started it, there were a lot of biologists who they were on the academic track, and they didn't really see the off ramps to go into industry and how you could start a company and start developing some of this stuff. And so I wanted that to be clearer to more people. I wanted the investors who were sitting on the sideline in other fields, but kind of thinking about dipping their toes into biotech, to see how fast it was going and what was going on, so that more of the venture capitalists, the VC firms, would devote a larger fraction of their portfolios to the aging and longevity field. There were reports of big investment banks sitting on the sidelines writing reports, and I think they didn't. My impression was they didn't realize how fast the field was going, and they knew they would eventually be playing, and I wanted to go faster. So things like that. So it was I could have tried to put some pricing models around it and stuff like that, but I think it would have hindered adoption, and what the whole point wasn't to make the money. The whole point was to make the field.
Yeah. And is it how you intend to keep it in future as well?
At the moment, yes.
Right.
Yeah. No plans to try to turn it into something else.
Right. So, Karl, from your perspective, how far have you come in developing biotech solutions for healthy aging and longevity?
So let's take a zoom back out really far. For, as you said in your intro, right, for centuries people have dreamed about Fountain of Youth, and then it's always been just a pipe dream. And then what's happened in the 20th century, in the late 20th century, we really started getting good molecular biological science that showed that aging was not an immutable clock that ticks at a fixed rate, but was instead something that was mutable. You could affect lifespan and how fast an organism aged. And that was a big wake-up call. And then over the decades since that happened, that science has gotten more and more clear. The number of ways in which you can interfere to speed up or slow down aging have become clearer. And the exact underlying molecular pathologies of aging have been detangled to the point where we know that there are a bunch of different underlying molecular pathologies that all interact with each other, but are somewhat distinct in terms of the kinds of things that happen within each cell and the kinds of cells that different things happen to. And so around, there were a couple embryonic companies that sort of maybe jumped the gun and were out a little early from very early science. And then what happened is in the 2010s is when some really big breakthroughs started to come in the academic side, and at the same time, some of the earlier stuff started really being translated into companies. So we started having enough data suggesting that we would, maybe be able to develop some of these interventions into pharmaceuticals that could go through FDA trials and really help millions of people. And so some companies started getting forming. And by the end of the 2010s, as we said, I think there were, on the order of 100 or so companies specifically doing things that addressed the core underlying aging pathways that were going to start commercializing, and so that's super exciting. So that's where we are now. So that started in the early 2010s, the first 50 to 100 companies. Now, the sequence, of course, is how do interventions, drugs or other interventions, get into the point where millions of people can use them, right? So first there's academic science, and and then that takes a while, and then it gets published, and at some point along the way, maybe it gets good enough that somebody decides to start a company, and then the company, and that academic research almost most of the time is just in animals or in cell culture or in vitro in test tubes, and then it gets into a company, and the company first starts with replicating the in vitro data, and then also doing stuff in animals, in invertebrates or short-lived species, or in mice eventually, because almost everything has to go in mice before it goes into people. And then if that's successful, then they go into clinical trials, and the clinical trials have phases 1, 2, and 3. And then if they're successful in that, and at each one of these stages, of course, lots of things fail. But if it's successful, it gets a million people. And the whole thing from the last point of academia to the, successful phase 3 clinical trials and getting into people, on average takes about a decade, right? There are some ways to speed up pieces of it, but, it's a slow process. And so it really started in earnest in the mid to late 2010s. So we are actually at a very exciting point right now, because we're sort of in the middle of that process. We haven't had enough time to really have a lot of these successes. There were a couple things as we detangled the molecular biology of aging,
Right.
there were, it was the case that, there are some companies formed specifically with the mission to solve aging or to do something, solve a piece of aging, and they're, who's just starting. But there were actually some companies out there that didn't come from the aging field, but whose therapeutic approaches really actually hit, once we understood what the aging pathways are, really did actually hit some of these fundamental aging pathways. And they were already on this 10-year road. They were somewhere in the middle of it. So right now, if you include all those kinds of companies, there are actually several companies in phase 3 clinical trials and several in phase 2 clinical trials who were really in process as the aging field got ramped up, but they are actually essentially addressing core aspects of aging. And so this is a super exciting time, because within 5 years, in the next 2 to 5 years, some of the clinical trials that are in phase 2 or 3 that really do address fundamental aging pathways could actually report and might actually be successful. And there's a lot coming down the path behind it. And there are a couple clinical trials for supplements and things where it was easier and you didn't have to go through the drug development process that are also going.
Right. Now that brings me to an interesting point, since you talked about the pathway. So obviously, if we look at the overall research landscape, there are a number of pathways that are currently being explored, such as genomic stability and DNA repair. There's cellular senescence, there is epigenetic regulation, there's mitochondrial function, there's nutrient sensing pathways and stem cell regeneration. Out of all of these, there's microbiome and gut health. Out of all these, where do you see the most promising research going on at the moment, and which areas, according to you, seem most promising?
Okay, so let's. I'm going to give you so if you ask this to different people, you'll get different answers. So
yes,
I'll try to give you a little bit of a high level view as well as my own personal opinion, right? So I think the best way to think about. So you listed a bunch of pathways, and it's important to let's throw out a few pointers for your listeners who
yes, indeed.
First of all, I think we didn't even mention the name of my website, which is AgingBioTech.info. Loads of information there, AgingBioTech.info. Now, you started listing a whole bunch of different sub areas within the field. There are multiple different categorizations of sub areas of the field that have been published in the literature. The most popular one is called The Hallmarks of Aging, and that was a paper in 2013. And then that was 9 original areas, and that was expanded to 12 to 15 recently. And then earlier there was a categorization of 7 areas in the SENS program, Strategies for Engineered Negligible Senescence. And both of the links to all of those papers can be found on AgingBioTech.info/categories, which tries to do a mapping of sort of all the different sub parts of the field and all the different subcategories of companies based on which of these subparts they go after. So, different people like different of these subcategorizations. Now, rising up a level from these 5 to 15 different categories, the most important high-level distinction in the field is the 2 main approaches. One is to slow the rate of aging, to sort of make the clock tick slower, and usually with a single therapeutic approach, a single molecule, basically by making the stuff that causes aging just run a little slower in the body, right? Aging is essentially mostly caused by life itself, by the metabolism of the metabolic health of your cells, the way the cells take in their inputs and process them and get energy and do their work. And there are ways to regulate how fast that happens. And so calorie restriction is one of the most famous ways to slow aging. Rapamycin is the most famous molecular drug. These things essentially work by slowing down this ticking rate. The other approach to the field is the sort of aging reversal damage repair approach. In that approach, the idea is that there are certain molecular changes that accumulate over time as side effects of the metabolic living. And we can catalog what those molecular changes are. And, from an engineering point of view, science is getting better and better at manipulating molecules, manipulating state, and we can just reverse those. So, for example, the analogy of rust builds up on your car, you scrape the rust away. So, for example, you mentioned senolytics, senescent cells. There's these pathological cells that accumulate over time called senescent cells. You let them build up for a while, and then you kill them. And then then you let them build up for a while, and then you kill them. And then, if you can catalog all the different bad molecular pathologies that and then fix each one periodically, then you can also combat aging that way. And so those are the two high-level main threads in the field. And different commercial approaches to take one or the other of those in general. And personally, I tend to favor the latter, the damage repair approach. It's a little bit, for one reason, because that's the only way to help people who are already old, right? Slowing aging rate approach works better when you're already only in midlife or young adulthood, because you can slow it down and the gains accumulate over time. But also, at the moment, it's not clear how good we can do in humans. In mice, we can make mice live 20 to 30%, maybe 50% longer with slowing aging approaches. But most people believe that will translate into humans at a much reduced relative benefit. So now let's get into the weeds. What did you said? What are the most promising approaches? So in the slow aging, everyone thinks rapamycin is probably one of the best drugs we have. It downregulates this pathway called mTOR. Calorie restriction is the most robust aging intervention anybody knows in terms of the total amount of data supporting it. It also downregulates mTOR. And it's just not clear we have much that, probably there are things out there that are better than either of those, but we don't know what they are yet. And, some people, that's what their main thing is to go find the things that are much better than those things. On the damage repair side, I think the most exciting things, and this is where my favorite parts of the subfields of the field are, is senolytics, which we talked about clearly.
Yes.
Cells that build up, and I've got 3 companies in my investment portfolio that have 3 different approaches to this. I think this is going to be one of the things that really puts the field on the map with the wider public, because those are long within 5 to 8 years, and there's so many. There are good bits of data suggesting that the accumulation of those senescent cells are involved in at least 20 age-related conditions. So that's one field. Epigenetic reprogramming is super exciting. This is the DNA is the sort of library of things your cell can build, and but it turns out that these little markers on the DNA and the way the DNA coils all affect what proteins actually get made.
Folding.
How each different cell knows what kind of cell it is. They affect how, all the cells have the same DNA, but different cell types are distinguished by their epigenetics. And we now know that epigenetics changes consistently over time, and this is how most aging clocks work. And we also know now that you can modify this epigenome. You can modify the way the DNA gets marked, and doing so in a way that specifically makes cells effectively younger. And so there's loads of work going on in that right now. I have several companies in my portfolio that are working on this. This is the area that has generated the most investment in biotech startups in recent years, with one $3 billion startup focusing exclusively on this. So this is a super exciting area. The other area, my third favorite area, is based on stem cells. So stem cells have been around for a while. That was sort of a whole separate field that goes under the umbrella term regenerative medicine. That field had a whole life of its own, and it sort of sits side by side with aging and longevity, and it hasn't had as much success as people thought it might have 20 years ago. One of the big breakthrough understandings in that area in the last decade or two is that the stem cells that you inject often don't then engraft and do long-term great things for the body. Instead, they die pretty soon after they go into the body, but somehow they still have a great effect. So it turns out they go in, and then they send off these signals, and those signals have some positive rejuvenating effect on the cells that are already in the body, even though those cells are old. And so people are starting to map what those secretions are, and there are some companies that are taking the signals themselves and making them into individual therapies, and other companies that are taking the signals themselves and just giving all of them back as the the therapeutic instead of the stem cells themselves. And there are various regulatory reasons why this is a little nicer, and the FDA is a little more friendly to this because you're not inserting things with DNA into them, into people, and seems a little safer. So I think that's a super interesting area, and I think it actually ties to the epigenetic reprogramming area, because I think that some of these stem cell secretions are effectively doing epigenetic reprogramming, though they're not studied that way. So I think those two fields might converge slightly.
Right. And are you able to name some of these startups or biotechs?
So in the senolytic area, there's a whole bunch of different approaches. The Gen 1 approach, of course, was to, a lot of early Gen 1 senolytics were basically repurposed chemo drugs, right? Killing senescent cells is a little bit like killing cancer cells, right? You have this
cancer cells,
bad cell type, you want to kill it. The trick is finding something that preferentially does more damage to the cell type you want to kill and doesn't hurt healthy cells as much or at all, ideally. And so some drugs that were designed for cancer, people tested them and found that the senescent cells, so they found they killed the senescent cells more than regular cells. Why is that? Well, it's important to understand senescent cells are basically damaged in some way. When a cell becomes damaged, usually it just dies. If it's too damaged, it usually just dies, or it limps along and the immune system comes and kills it. And somehow some fraction of cells that this happens to don't die and somehow avoid the immune system surveillance and become cancerous. It's believed that one of the reasons senescent cells evolved is so that they go into this state. They can become cancerous, or they can go into this senescent state, and the senescent state is defined essentially by the inability to replicate, so the inability to divide, which essentially means that they can't be cancerous. So that's great, right? If you do have a cell that's damaged enough that somehow it doesn't commit suicide and die, and somehow the immune system doesn't kill it, you would rather it become senescent than become cancerous.
Senescent.
So that's great in the short term, but in the long term, it turns out when they go into this state, they secrete these inflammatory signals that are bad for the cells around them. And it's one of the contributors to chronic inflammation. And so it's good short term that they're not cancerous, but it's bad long term for them to stay around and not die and keep setting off these siren signals, like somebody pulling the fire alarm all the time. So that's why we want to periodically kill them. It turns out they have some benefits, and evolution likes to repurpose things, and so they actually play beneficial roles in wound healing and in other immune responses, maybe to infection. I'm not sure, so you don't want to necessarily prevent the body from ever creating cells like this, but there's no benefit to them if they live for decades. So that's why it's good to every so often clear them away. So how can we do this? This is why. So since they're damaged like cancer cells, this is why chemo drugs work also, because cancer cells are pretty fragile, and senescent cells are more fragile than regular cells. So you give any kind of a shove to cells, make them all teeter a little bit, these cells will generally die preferentially. So that's how chemo drugs work, and the simplistic ones. But these do have negative side effects because they hurt regular cells too. So Gen 2 senolytics are on their way, and there's a bunch of different interesting approaches. So I'll talk about this. There's a company called Oisin. It's OISIN, so it's a Gaelic term. So to talk about them, what we have to talk about is the main experiment that put senolytics on the map, that made senolytics super popular, was to just study how important are senescent cells for aging and health and longevity. What they did was they created with mice, with lab animals, you can use genetic tools to create new lines of mice that have different things that are easier to test. And so they created a transgenic line of mice that where you could just give a simple drug and all of the senescent cells would die. In this case, it was the P16 expressing cells, which was believed to be a reasonable approximation, Venn diagram approximation for senescent cells. So they created a line of transgenic mice where they could kill all the P16 expressing, overexpressing cells, and then they gave the drug that does this every so often, and they found that these mice lived 25% longer and had great health. And so then somebody else, and this was replicated by another lab, and this got everybody really excited. And this is what led to the founding of Unity Biotechnology, which was the first big biotech to really go after senescent cells. It actually went public, and then they had a phase 2 trial for knee osteoarthritis that failed, and they've had an eye trial fail and another eye trial succeed in phase 2. And but their drug is a first generation drug, so
Right.
you want to sort of use it in like the eye or somewhere where it's not getting everywhere in the body. So this company Oshin has a gene therapy platform, so you can basically do the same thing, kill all the P16 positive P16 expressing cells, or you can kill any cells that express any particular gene over. So they have a platform that can essentially replicate those original experiments, and they're pursuing that through the clinic. And they have their platforms useful for other things too. So they're currently have just raised a Series A round, and still in preclinical for both the senolytics and their new things are pivoting to muscle and obesity, because they can use the same technique to kill, for example, just adipose tissue cells.
Right. And these therapies are taken orally, or they are injectables?
Well, this is a gene therapy platform. So I think there's a couple routes they can use, but I think they're doing injection.
Right.
So then two other companies that do totally different approaches. So there's a company called Deciduous, where they have figured out which immune cell type normally kills a large fraction of the senescent cells in the body. And it turns out one of the reasons senescent cells accumulate as people age is that the immune system surveillance declines as people age. And this is also why cancer goes up as people age, right? The immune system when you're in your 20s and 30s in humans is pretty good at killing these cells. But certain parts of the immune system don't function as well when you get old. The thymus involutes, and you don't get as good T cells, and a bunch of other things change. So Deciduous scientists figured out which cell types were mostly responsible for killing, and in particular, there's one cell type which isn't usually talked about as much as any other immune cell types, called the invariant natural killer T cell. And so they figured out that was primarily responsible for killing certain large collections of senescent cells, and that it declines with age. And they figured out a small molecule that pokes just that cell, that kicks it back into high gear for a little while, and so they have great preclinical data on idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, IPF, and some other data on some other diseases. So they're still in preclinical, but they're pursuing that. And then so both of those two companies' approaches to senescent cell clearance are systemic. So if they succeed and if they get to clinic for whatever indications they go for initially, like IPF in the case of Deciduous, then the great thing is there's probably going to be benefit for off-label prescribing and/or for label expansion quickly to other diseases, which is wonderful. So the third company I want to mention is called Rebedo. Rebedo is taking a very slice and dice approach. So they're characterizing different. The science has become clear that different senescent cell subtypes exist, and that they're all a little bit different. And Rebedo is taking a prodrug approach. So, just like with killing cancer cells, with killing senescent cells, you want specificity. You want to damage other cells as little as possible while killing as many as possible of the target cells. So that's a little easier to do if you define the target cells a little more narrowly. So they're doing this, and they're using a prodrug approach, so that they're giving drugs to kill the senescent cells that already have slightly, preferential killing of the senescent cells and hurting the other cells less. But in addition, then they're wrapping those drugs in a prodrug is essentially a drug that isn't itself in its chemically active form, but that you put it into the cell in a different form, and some chemical reaction in the body transforms it into the actual drug that has the efficacy. And so Rebedo's developing prodrugs for each different subcategory of senescent cells that they want to go after for different diseases. So they can tune these things very, very precisely for different disease conditions where particular kinds of senescent cells are very, very highly implicated. And so they're doing a great job. They've raised 2 Series A's, and they've announced this past spring, I think it was, they announced a huge collaboration with a giant skincare company the company of Coppertone and a bunch of other famous skincare brands that to do topical senescent cell clearance. And so they're a great company as well. So lots of exciting things. But there's another dozen companies working on senolytics.
Yeah.
And another 5 to 10 working on other approaches to senescent cells, either suppressing their inflammatory signaling or preventing cells from turning senescent or taking senescent cells and turning them back into being non-senescent cells. There's a whole variety of approaches.
Now, looking specifically at your investment experience, you've been involved in funding biotech startups for a while. What advice would you give to those looking to invest in the aging space? And do you also see an opportunity for small investors to invest into this area?
So there's a lot of different answers to this question depending on exactly what kind of investor you are and how much you want to do this as simply an portfolio allocation decision versus something you spend time on, right? So, so at the moment, this is a field where it's just mostly biotech startups that are privately held. There are a few public companies in the space, and AgingBioTech.info/companies has a column for whether it's public or not. So you can easily just select all and only the public company. So if you're a retail investor who's not accredited and can only invest in public companies, then you're limited to only 20 or so companies at the moment. Investing in public companies it helps a little because it pushes the prices up slightly, but it doesn't directly, whenever you buy a share, you're just buying it from somebody else. So it doesn't actually give the companies any money directly. So it doesn't make the field go faster as much. But if you believe the field is going to be successful, then that's one way to get exposure. There are no particular, there are ETFs and mutual funds for biotechnology, but nothing specific to aging and longevity so much yet. So most of the investment action is for accredited investors only. So people who can, I guess I don't know exactly what the requirements are for investing in VC funds and hedge funds and private equity. If you want exposure and you don't want to spend the time making your own investment decisions about which companies, then you're stuck by trusting somebody else and finding who that is to trust and investing in a venture capital fund that focuses on the area or a private equity or hedge fund. Most of the actions in the venture capital funds. So there are a few venture capital funds that do specialize in the area. Most of them are listed at AgingBioTech.info/investors cross companies, which shows you which companies they've invested in, at least the ones whose portfolios are public. There are a couple that play in the space that have LPs that don't make their portfolios public, and therefore they can't be listed there. And there are some that are listed there that aren't really active anymore. So it's not a perfect way to find all the choices. But like anything in this space, networking is a good way to figure out who the real people are. So if you want to actually spend time and choose individual companies, then of course the best thing to do is to spend time going to events, talking to as many people as possible, networking online, doing your research and homework by looking at sites like AgingBioTech.info/companies for the broad overview and seeing what's related to what. And there's really no substitute for doing that. But of course, if you're new to the field and you don't know the science, then you need to find people to help guide you. So, it's good to read books, listen to podcasts, and it's a slow ramp up. It's not something you can become good at very, very quickly. But of course, if you have a background in technology, or if you have a background in medicine, or if you have a background in investing in other sectors, then that's those are the pieces that you will slowly get good at if you want to. And so those will give you a leg up. But personally, I think the important thing for anybody who does do this is to think about what, those high level views of the field I mentioned. Do you want to invest in slow aging approaches versus in aging reversal approaches? what kind of time frame do you have for your return, right? These biotech startups are slower than investing in tech startups because clinical trials take a long time. So, and if you do want to, I mean, my high level advice for anybody who wants to invest in the sector, by picking individual companies, is really focus on the science of the mechanism of action and make sure you think that it's a reasonable approach.
Right. And then if we talk about the market access or access to the patients, how soon do you think these therapies will start hitting the market? And also, I'm assuming these therapies, if they are very, very successful, they are going to be expensive. And are they going to be available to common people?
So let's take the second one first. There's much hand-wringing about how expensive they're going to be. And there's a couple different answers there. So first of all, the expense will vary widely depending on the modality of the therapy, right? Small molecule drugs aren't actually that expensive. So when those get approved, most of the expense is going to be just for the patent lifetime so that the pharmaceutical company that brings them to market can recoup the development costs. And we want that because that's what causes millions of dollars to pour into the research needed in order to actually find the successful ones. And so, that means for 2 decades ish, they'll be somewhat expensive, but not that expensive. And then they'll be sort of dirt cheap. Fancier things that are coming along are more expensive, right? So gene therapy is more expensive. Cell therapies like CAR T is more expensive. But those things are coming down in cost. And the question is, how will the access be initially, right? What happens with everything in life, and this applies to, safety features in cars like airbags and anti-lock brakes too. What happens, everything starts out expensive, and if it's based on technology, it generally gets cheaper over time. So there's often a period where there's a curve and the wealthier people can afford it, and then quickly more and more people can afford it, and then everybody can afford it. And then, I'm sure this is going to happen for some fraction of the therapies, but only the fancier, weirder ones are going to have that at first. And then there's a third aspect to this question, which is, nothing is going to be so expensive that it's more expensive than how much current sick care clinical medicine spends on people for life. Right. So if you look at the amount of money that governments and insurance and Medicare spend on, keeping an 80-year-old alive for 5 to 10 more years while they have so many different medical conditions, it is astronomical. Right. So once these things come along, even if they cost millions of dollars per patient, governments are going to quickly figure out that that's actually still cheaper than what Medicare will pay for them to go through what the current system is. And so eventually, smart governments are going to figure out that this is worth paying for and subsidizing, and the cost to the individual person is not going to be insurmountable. This is one of, so this is where I also have to mention that this is one of the common objections to the field, right? There's a certain set of people who hear about the aging and longevity field who think that it actually sounds like a bad idea for science to try to solve these problems, because, oh my goodness, if they did, we might have overpopulation because people aren't dying as much, or it might only be for the rich, and so it might cause greater inequity in the population. Surprisingly, of course, some people will actually kind of almost humorously give you both of those objections at the same time. It's only going to be for the 1%, but it's going to cause overpopulation, which of course is absurd. It has, can't be both. Anyway, there's about 10 or 11 objections that people commonly come up with. And and for each one of those 10 or 11, very smart people have thought very carefully about them, gathered the best data, thought about, the ethical and moral arguments around them, and written very good long responses. And I collected all of those responses and counter-arguments to all of the most common objections in a table called Objections on the website. So AgingBioTech.
Oh, really?
Objections. And so the first one is overpopulation. There's 3 good responses to that and links to longer treatments. And the second one is exactly the access expense issue, only for the rich issue that you brought up. And so I kind of gave you a summary of a couple of the responses, but you should go there and read more carefully about them in general.
Sure.
Anytime anybody has a an objection to, we shouldn't actually do science to make people live longer. You should, the litmus test in your head response is, should we also stop trying to cure cancer then? Right? Why shouldn't we stop trying to cure cancer? And if we shouldn't, then why shouldn't we try to prevent cancer by preventing people from getting old, and then also prevent heart disease, et cetera?
Looking at some of the more cost-effective options, for instance, metformin and rapamycin are considered to play an important role in reversing the aging process. What's your view on that?
This is a good, timely question. So it's very clear that lifespan is affected by lifestyle. So in humans, lifestyle, what quality of your diet, how much you eat, whether you exercise, and how well you sleep, whether you smoke, whether you abuse alcohol, all of these things together, if you lump them together in humans, makes a 10 to 20 year difference in human lifespan. And not just lifespan, but it's a 10 to 20 year difference in how quickly we develop all the pathologies of aging, how quickly we get osteoarthritis, how quickly we develop heart disease and cancer and Alzheimer's and other neurodegeneration, and with lifespan being the ultimate readout. So 10 to 20 years difference. So that's 10 to 20% or more variation, and we can see the same thing in all model species. So in mice and rats and in invertebrates, if you feed them less, they live longer. If they overeat, they live shorter, right? There's, high-fat diets for mice that cause all kinds of problems. So there's actually a very important point being made in the field right now by several researchers who are top people in the field, that what you see in experiments with mice is that you'll often get an experiment that shows lifespan extension. You'll have a set, a set of mice, and it was a randomized controlled experiment. So you randomize them, and then you get the controls live this long, and the treated group with some particular treatment live longer and by a meaningful amount. But then if you look across experiments, you'll find that the controls, even of the same strain of mice, have quite varied lifespans across the different studies done by different groups. And sometimes the treated group that you were so happy they lived 20% longer than the controls, but it turns out they still lived shorter than the control mice in some other experiment. And so some pillars of the field, Matt Kaberlein and Brian Kennedy, just came out with a paper this month talking about this problem of short-lived controls causing over-exaggeration of the lifespan extending effects, and how when the controls are short-lived and you get this high percentage relative increase, that maybe don't trust that unless the controls were, you want papers where the controls were already long-lived and then you went beyond that. Otherwise, you're just basically like bringing those bad kind of impaired animals up to the sort of normal longevity normalizing. So this happens in, and so this is the thing with rapamycin and metformin. So metformin appears to extend lifespan under certain circumstances, but its effects are weaker. And so they hypothesized that maybe metformin is just a longevity normalizing thing. It's a diabetes drug originally. So maybe if you have dysregulated metabolism, you have overeating, you have diabetes, then maybe it helps, get you back to the lifespan of sort of your average healthy person, but it doesn't actually fundamentally. So rather than it being a longevity drug in the sense of it fundamentally affects a core aspect of aging that affects everybody and therefore extends everybody's life, maybe what it does is it's something that's impairing everybody, that's speeding up your aging. So I like to think about it this way. Imagine you had a snake venom, you had a poisonous snake, and maybe it was very poisonous, and if you got bitten a lot, you die completely. But if you get just the right dose of this poison, you live in a place where this snake is mildly poisonous, and it's hard to avoid getting bitten once a week. And it turns out that it's bad for you. So the people who live in this place, they live a little shorter because getting the snake venom accelerates your aging, essentially makes you age faster, right? But if you just have the antidote for this poison, right, it would help all the people who live in that place who get bitten all the time. It would help them live as long as all the people in the rest of the world. That's great. It would be a longevity extending drug because it's just for this antidote for this thing that speeds up aging. But it wouldn't actually extend the lifespan of all the other people who don't get this snake.
Exactly.
Right. So metformin and rapamycin. The question is, to what extent are they like the antidote to the snake venom? If you're diabetic, that's bad, and that really does accelerate your aging. And if you take metformin, that seems to rescue that.
Yes.
There's some suggestion that maybe the people on the diabetics who took metformin lived longer than the healthy non-diabetic controls, which is what made people think it was maybe a longevity drug. But so far, there's not actually any really good data showing that it extends lifespan in healthy, or seems to extend lifespan in healthy controls. For example, Nir Barzilai is one of the biggest proponents in the field for metformin, but he's aghast at the idea of people who are in middle age or young and non-diabetic taking it.
Right.
So I made a post that you can find on my LinkedIn and my Twitter, a post today about these papers warning about the problem of short-lived controls and trying to extend the idea to humans, right? So, there are many things we can do, abuse alcohol, smoke, eat too much, and be obese that will accelerate rate of aging. And, our fixes, we should probably be a little skeptical of that fixes for those things, for example, obesity drugs, are actually addressing a core aspect of aging versus simply being antidotes to these age accelerating problems.
Exactly.
And this is my problem in general with the slow aging approach to the field is I think there's not yet any good data showing that any approaches to slowing aging will actually outperform optimizing lifestyle, right? If you optimize diet, overall weight, exercise, sleep, not abusing any substances, including alcohol and tobacco, then, it's not clear that anything that we have currently will be able to do better than that. All the people who live the healthiest possible lifestyle still accumulate senescent cells. They still accumulate epigenetic changes. They still have immune decline. So we still need to fix all of those problems. And so that's my favorite approach to the field, is fixing each one of those problems separately, and then we'll have to aggregate them all to have full solutions.
Right.
Whenever you see human data, you should ask yourself, would this have worked in lean, healthy people?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So if you give metformin to normal, healthy people, it may not have any effect. But if you give it to a diabetic patient, their lifespan might improve because they're taking metformin. It would help them reduce weight and carry on for a longer time.
And there's a famous trial that's almost funded, that they've been trying to get underway for a while, called the TAME trial, targeting aging with metformin, where the idea is to give it to healthy older people who aren't diabetic and who have, I think, one age-related disease, and wait 7 years and see if they get more age-related diseases less than the people who don't take it. So the question is, so multi-morbidity is sort of the outcome, because they're not going to wait, you can't wait the decades it'll take for them all to die.
Yes.
That might suggest some aging benefit, but my guess is that if they do this trial in the US, it's going to mostly be with people who are overweight, and as a result, it won't tell us whether or not it would work in people who are closer to the healthy end of the lifestyle.
Right. Got it. Very well explained. I really liked your analogy of snake venom. That was very helpful. Karl, if you could predict one major breakthrough in aging biotechnology in the next 5 years, what would it be?
This is a great question, right? And this is sort of, and I think the next 5 years is the right time frame. I mean, I guess there's two different versions of your question, right? A breakthrough sort of on the academic side versus a breakthrough in the sense of like getting through clinical trials, right? So there are several things in phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials, and we could try to pick which one of them, is going to work, right? There are a number of candidates. There are a number of stem cell trials from stem cell companies. There are a number of trials for neurodegenerative diseases using a number of different approaches. There are a couple phase 3 and a couple more phase 2 trials in the area of mitochondria. And
Right.
I don't know. It's really, I think any one of these or multiple of these could all report and be successful, because they all look good so far. But of course,
Right.
one in five or one in 10, I don't know what the dropout rate at phase 2 and phase 3 specifically are, but most of them won't work, but we just don't know which ones. But I think that it's a good chance that something that's related to stem cells is going to work, because it's clear there's real efficacy there. And the question is more, will there be negative effects, and will the trial be run right, and is the indication chosen well? So I wouldn't be surprised to see something in the regenerative medicine tradition come through. There's really clear evidence that mitochondria are super important for health in general, especially for aging, and so I wouldn't be surprised to see one of the mitochondria approaches come through. And I actually recently posted on LinkedIn and Twitter a big report on the current state of mitochondria approaches to aging, including a list of all the companies that are in different phases of clinical trials. So anybody who wants to can go check that out and see which ones they think are most likely. And then in terms of predicting breakthroughs at earlier stages, not breakthrough in terms of getting approved for the market, but I think the big thing that's most exciting right now is in epigenetic reprogramming. The situation there is that in the Yamanaka famously got the Nobel Prize in the early 2010s for research from the 2000s that he did on taking cells that are not pluripotent stem cells and turning them back into pluripotent stem cells, and they're called induced pluripotent stem cells, using these 4 transcription factors that are now known as the Yamanaka factors. And that's reprogramming, because you're reprogramming the cell from being one type of cell into being a stem cell. And in the mid 2010s, it was realized that you could, and this is done by Belmonte's lab at the Salk, it was realized that you could apply those factors, but not apply them all the way back to the amount of time it takes to make a pluripotent stem cell, but just apply them for a while. And what happens is the cell doesn't forget its identity; it stays whatever type of cell it was, but it becomes younger. It has a lot of benefit of youthful properties, and so that kicked off a whole explosion in work on using Yamanaka factors to try to rejuvenate cells without causing them to turn into stem cells, which might then carry, cancer risk or teratoma risk. So since that time in the 2000s now, a lot of people have been starting to look for alternatives to the Yamanaka factor. The idea is that these Yamanaka factors both rejuvenate the cell and turn it and cause it to lose its identity, de-differentiate. But it turns out that you can detangle those. There are different transcription factors and other therapeutic approaches that can cause you to either preferentially cause the cell to lose its identity but not rejuvenate, or preferentially cause it to rejuvenate but not lose its identity. So there's a whole bunch of teams working on looking for ways to cause it to rejuvenate, become a younger cell without losing its identity, or using its identity as little as possible. And so there are teams at Altos, I'm sure, looking at this. There's a company that was working on this before Altos got formed called Shift Bio. I'm an investor in that company. They're based in the UK, and they've been explicitly doing this as a thing. A team at Calico led by Jacob Kimmel was working on this, and then he went off to form New Limit, which is a very, very well-funded company that's doing a very large systematic screen. But this is the main goal: finding rejuvenating epigenetic factors that don't differentiate. And then there's a company called Junevity that came out of UCSF recently, with a screen as well that was based on a PhD that I'm also an investor in. I think that there's going to be a big breakthrough here. I think we are going to find, I think one of these companies or multiple of these companies are going to find several different ways to rejuvenate cells without causing them to lose their cell identity better than the Yamanaka factors, because the Yamanaka factors were discovered based on screening specifically to cause identity loss to create stem cells again. So now the hunt is on for the other goal, just to rejuvenate. And so with multiple groups working on it, I think there's going to be big breakthroughs here. But this is all still in the preclinical stage. But New Limit is reporting good progress on finding a lot of candidates. Shift is also finding candidates, and Junevity's PhD work that's based on published 4 transcription factors that shown benefit as part of the PhD. I think we're going to see some kind of big gain here, and I think there's going to be lots of different applications or indications that this can then be applied to. And the early reports of lifespan extension just from Yamanaka Factors stuff coming out of Altos and all the good work on Yamanaka cocktails coming out of Vittorio Sebastiani's lab at Stanford that are now going into the biotech called Turn Bio, which I'm also an investor in.
Right.
I think there's just the early indication of using Yamanaka Factors is very promising. So the idea that one of these groups looking for alternatives is going to find something big, I think, is very enticing.
Wow, that's absolutely mind-blowing to know about all these developments that are taking place.
Preclinical, so then that will take 5 or 10 years.
Absolutely, sure. What does healthy aging mean to you personally? Are there any lifestyle habits or practices you follow based on the latest aging research and the knowledge that you have in this area?
So I personally, as we talked about earlier with some of the short-lived control stuff, I'm very compelled by the data showing that lifestyle matters, especially diet and exercise. So, I don't smoke, I don't abuse alcohol. In fact, I've stopped drinking entirely in the last 10 years, and I don't use any other recreational substances. I've never smoked, and I try to optimize both diet and exercise and sleep as much as possible. So I don't do anything basically. I don't take metformin or rapamycin or anything else people consider a longevity drug. I take supplements, sort of the normal supplements, right? Omega-3, vegan. I eat a whole food plant-based vegan diet, sort of Ornish style, and since I'm vegan, I take fish oil and some algae oil and flaxseed, and I take vitamin D because I live in a latitude where that's important at least a portion of the year, and that could be a whole other podcast. Vitamin D is very important, and almost certainly vitamin D deficiency speeds aging. So I compiled a table of all the other things that are currently available that a lot of people propose as longevity interventions under AgingBioTech.info/therapeutics. And one of the problems with all of these things right now is that the quality of data that they improve if you've optimized all these lifestyle factors is very low. But in addition, the other big problem is that we don't have the right diagnostics and biomarkers yet to tell which people are going to benefit from them and which, and how do you titrate dose. So a lot of these things hit certain pathways and we know the mechanism of action, and we might even know, upstream and downstream some of the things. But we don't necessarily have a readout that we could go get a blood test and see where we are on any of those levels in order to know, are we in a sweet spot now, or do we need to tweak it in one direction or the other direction? Most things in biology have U-shaped risk curves, but we don't always know where we are. And, if you're overweight and you eat too much, then probably you should downregulate your mTOR, and maybe rapamycin would help with that, or eating less protein or eating less overall would help with that. But, if you're trying to optimize it and you think you've got the lifestyle optimized, it's not clear which of those therapies would actually help. So, I'm not against taking them when the data becomes good, but I don't see good data for anything that's currently available showing that it would really help somebody who's optimized all the major lifestyle things as much.
Exactly. There are so many moving parts, and it's hard to keep a track of everything that's going on. Any hands-on experience with intermittent fasting? Do you have any advice on that topic?
Yeah, this is a topic where you shouldn't necessarily trust my advice, but I'll give you my view.
Sure.
There's lots of data on this, and there's lots of slightly different opinions. Almost certainly, intermittent fasting is better than doing nothing especially if you eat too much. So, and some people find that it's a much easier way to eat less, right? So, being lean is very important for lifespan. Above a BMI of about 22 or 22 and a half, it's pretty clear that the data show that increasing BMI leads to shorter lifespan and earlier onset of bad health. There's some data that suggests that it's actually better to be higher than 22 or 22 and a half, based on simplistic reading of the data. But if you do the correct survivorship bias statistical corrections, it looks like the leaner is better down to 18 and a half to 22 or 22 and a half. So a lot of people have trouble eating less or exercising more, and find that simply doing intermittent fasting is an easier way for them to eat less. So,
Yes.
the most important thing is to, keep calorie totals down, eat healthy quality calories. And so if intermittent fasting helps with that, great. There's also pretty good quality data showing that you want to at least sync up your calorie consumption with circadian rhythms, right? So you want to eat
Mm-hmm.
day and not eat during the night. And shift work is of course terrible, and so I don't know what to advise people for that. But
Yeah.
assuming you do sleep at night and are awake during the day, late snacks or middle of the night snacks are worse than keeping all your stuff to at least the 12 or 13 hour window of daylight, and having ideally a 12 or 13 hour fast overnight each night, because that helps solidify circadian rhythms, above and beyond whatever other effects of 12 or 13 hour fast. I don't think there's a lot of good data suggesting that 16-hour fasts are that much better than 13 or 12 or 13 or 14-hour fasts. Some people really swear sort of 8, 16, only eating in an 8-hour window. More importantly, I'm compelled by the data showing that high fiber intake is very, very healthy. You want to eat plants. You want to eat a lot of unrefined, unprocessed plants, and those are the only foods that have fiber. I don't believe in fiber supplements. I think you want your fiber from real food. And so in order to digest real food that has high fiber content, it's not easy to digest. So it's hard to squeeze a normal calorie consumption into a 4-hour eating window or a 6-hour eating window or even an 8-hour eating window. It's hard to have 3 high fiber meals in an 8-hour eating window even. So that's why I do a 11 or 12-hour eating window. But I eat like 75 or 80 grams of fiber per day. Evolutionarily, we evolved eating that much to up to 150 grams of fiber per day, and most people get like 10 grams of fiber per day. The recommended 25, but even that's pretty poor. So so that's now the other important comment on intermittent fasting is that cancer cells really want to be fed even more than our regular healthy cells, and so there probably is there's sort of good evidence, and Walter Longo's done a lot of this on fasting and cancer. So it's probably a good idea to, as an anti-cancer strategy, to a cancer prevention, not necessarily like if you have cancer, follow the advice of your oncologist. And there's sort of lots of good data on fasting for people who have cancer in tandem with chemo, and that helping. And read all of Walter Longo's stuff on this, and try to find an oncologist that knows about this literature if they're going to dismiss it. There's trickiness there because cachexia, I can't pronounce it, is a wasting away that tends to happen with cancer when the cancer takes all the good calories and your body doesn't get the rest. And so you want to avoid that and eat more, but there's a little trade-off there, and it's tricky. But for preventing cancer in the first place, if you're healthy, it's probably not a bad idea to fast now and then and wipe out those early cancer cells that want the food more than your regular cells, because your regular cells can handle it better. Of course, it does inhibit, you can overfast too, and it'll inhibit muscle growth, and muscle is very important as you get older too. So you want to definitely exercise regularly and not fast and stop exercising.
Right. And on this topic, one last question about semaglutide, because there's some data coming in which shows that semaglutide has some effect on extending the lifespan, or at least there's a hypothesis in place. What's your view on that?
I mean, look at the data. All the data is going to be on non-lean people.
Yes.
Right. Yeah, so this goes in the same category as metformin. Maybe it's better than
metformin.
But so yes, if you have insulin dysregulation or metabolic disease, it's probably helpful. I personally think you'd be anybody who might consider it would be better off solving their metabolic problem by actually exercising more, eating healthier, getting lean, and that will have positive side effects and no negative side effects, and also solve the metabolic problem. And then I personally will wait for data showing that it works even in lean, metabolically healthy people, which I don't think exists.
Right. Yeah, that makes absolute sense. What role do you think the general public can play in supporting or contributing to the field of aging biotech?
Great question. So multiple different answers here. So This is a bit of a revolution right now. In some ways, we're sitting on the cusp of something that's going to fundamentally change society, just like the internet and the World Wide Web did and smartphones did, compared to sort of the dot-com internet 1.0 days of the 1990s. I think we're sort of around 1994 or 1995 right now, but on a slower time scale. So, on a time scale that might play out over 20 to 30 years instead of a decade. We're maybe in the 40 or 50 percentile of the way through. So lots of important things need to happen. The world needs to wake up to what's going on. Governments need to wake up to what's going on and fund it more. Right now, almost all biomedical and biology fundamental science is funded by the governments in these silos that are disease specific, and their whole medical system is set up as a sick care system where we call it healthcare, but really we wait until a disease actually develops before we do anything about it and treat it and diagnose it and treat it. And by then it's too late, or it's at least much harder. I mean, not that you can't get some benefit, but you'd be better off preventing it in the first place. And studying those underlying mechanisms that underlie all the different diseases is not funded nearly as much. Right now, the NIH, that only gets funding through the NIA, and only less than half of the NIA budget goes to that. The rest of the NIA budget is mostly Alzheimer's disease, so it's disease specific. So we need a fundamental shift in the resource allocation to the study of the fundamental biology of aging and how to translate treatments for it. And from a regulatory point of view, we probably need some change there too, right? Regulation is set up so that you can only create a therapeutic pharmaceutical, a drug or other kind of therapeutic for an existing disease. You can't treat just because it causes one to age slower, even though that would then prevent multiple different diseases. So there's going to need to be a way to get faster regulatory approval for things, or at least some way to go after aging related things. Maybe this is probably going to require work on biomarkers. So there's both science here and regulatory adaptation. But the best way for individual people who are just fans of this approach to take is most importantly, the thing everybody can do is just talk about it. Talk about it with your neighbor, talk about it with your family, talk about it with your politicians. There's a political group, political lobbying group now called the A4LI, the Alliance for Longevity Initiatives, that has a bipartisan caucus of Congress people involved, and they're pushing for regulatory issue changes and funding changes. For example, they just had a white paper on creating a new institute that was really fundamentally designed to study aging and not just a single disease. So there's talk about it, read about it, learn about it more. So listen to podcasts like this, listen to the other podcasts I have on my list on AgingBioTech.info/podcasts, read books, AgingBioTech.info/books has a lot of good books. Give the books away to gifts and talk about them with other people, get other people to read about them. If you want to network, feel free to network in the area. There's a bunch of different forums to talk about it online and groups that you can join for in-person meetups. Some of those you can find on AgingBioTech.info, at least the online forums. And if you have charitable money, if you're wealthy enough to at least give anything to any charity, consider giving to some of the charities that work in this space and fund some of this science advocacy. AgingBioTech.info/nonprofits gives a list of registered charities that you can donate to. There's donate buttons for each row that has a section on their webpage. Many of those do great work. I donate to half a dozen of those myself. And so that's the basics for people who want to pay attention and help, but go about their lives mostly. Then the next level is people who really want to actually dive in and actually not only help a little bit on the side, but really work in this field who don't know how, right? So obviously if you're a biologist, that's easy. If you're not, if you're young enough that you're still in school, learn biology, learn biotechnology, learn about some of the different areas. This is something that is a great career to go into. If you're, doing something else and you already have a job and this isn't your area, you can, make a lot of money and then you can invest in the area as well as doing charity. If you have an adjacent, there's going to be a lot of different adjacent skills. So bioinformatics is going to be real. So a lot of people in software are really inspired by this. there's more interest from people in software than there is positions available at the moment. But as the biotech subsector of biotech that's focused on this scales, there'll be more and more companies who need software skills and bioinformatics skills. So if you're adjacent in the sort of software field or AI, you can learn some of the biology for how to pivot your skills to do biological data. That might be a slow process, but you can take courses on the side, or you can, when you're looking for your next job, consider looking. There's a couple job boards. You can see AgingBioTech.info/jobs for a couple job boards that you can look around to. Most of those jobs, there's not very many at the moment, and a lot of the companies that are startups don't post their positions as jobs. So if you really want to work at a startup, you have to network. But those are some of the things that you can do.
Right. That was an incredibly insightful conversation, Karl. And this brings us to the end of our today's episode. And Karl, I want to express my sincere gratitude for joining us today on Drug Diaries. Your insights into the longevity biotech landscape have been truly enlightening. And I'm sure our listeners have gained a wealth of knowledge from our conversation. And your ability to break down complex scientific concepts and investment strategies in such an accessible way is remarkable, absolutely remarkable. And your work in AgingBioTech.info is clearly making significant impact in bridging the gap between cutting-edge longevity research and public understanding. And it's inspiring to see how your background in AI and tech has translated into such an impactful work in the biotech space. Thank you so much for sharing your time, your expertise, and passion with us today. And I'm confident that our listeners will come away from this episode with a deeper understanding of the exciting developments in longevity research and perhaps even a renewed optimism about the future of human health.
It was a great pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Karl.